Yeah, no, I don't know. It's just like it's kind of nice just chatting with people that are from, I guess, the same cohort as
Yeah, exactly.
for
The grandfather early adopters.
exactly. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think we started right around the same time. When did you start again?
I think I started using it seriously, I guess, January 2020.
January. Okay. Yeah, that's when I
Uh,
started serious usage too. I was like end of December, like 24th, 25th were my first few days.
yeah. Actually, I think it was December too, like end of 2019. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
no, actually, December 1st, I started some stuff in here.
Mm-hmm.
Funny.
Mm-hmm. Before we get going, was there anything you want to tell me about, like what your goals are, I guess, for this
Yeah,
conversation?
yeah, that's a good question. I am stress testing this model, basically, right? That's my goal.
Okay.
Uh, I found this thing that A is working pretty well for me that I'd like to share first with my students and then other people in the Rome community who are doing basically lit review stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
then it's also like a research project in the sense that I'm trying to explore how do we get people to change their note-taking behaviors so that it makes it easier to have this collective intelligence thing of people like being able to share notes with each other. Um, and that is secondary to the first thing is if I share this model and people are able to try it out and find it useful, that's my goal, my win. Um, so I'm trying to debug like um, clarity of explanation. What am I missing out? Because I'm trying to articulate something that's quite fairly tacit.
Mm-hmm.
It's like my practice. It's also grounded in like theory and
Mm-hmm.
literature and stuff. And so like just kind of talking through where things seem more or less clear, and then walking through some examples. Um, that would be my goal to like basically create an artifact that lowers the barrier for someone else to make sense of
Mm-hmm.
this and try it out.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it's
Sometimes
really
just
really hard to write it in a document, right?
mm,
And I could like do a video walkthrough, but it's a lot more effective if someone else is asking questions as I'm going through it, you know?
yeah, that's kind of like one of the things I try to do with the tours is
Yeah.
it's just like I feel like people's own practices, so much of it is implicit,
Mm-hmm.
like that we
Yeah.
intuitive that we don't even really think about or notice to talk
Yeah.
about, and
Yeah.
so sometimes it's helpful just having another person who can ask questions at
Yeah.
the moments where
Yeah.
something's going on that isn't entirely stated.
Yeah. Especially yeah, something I would gloss over that would be
Hmm.
important for someone to know when they if they want to try it out.
Yeah.
So that's my goal. Like if we create an artifact that makes it even easier for my PhD students to like grok the system,
Hmm.
then I consider that a win. Yeah.
Awesome. If we could start off with you just kind of telling everybody a little bit about, who you are,
Right.
and
Yeah.
what your research is, that would be really fantastic.
Okay. Sounds good. Yeah. So I'm Joel Chan, and I am a assistant professor in the information science department at the University of Maryland. And I use Rome for my research and my personal life as well. But in addition, my research projects right now are centered around tools for thought, broadly speaking. And so that's also Rome is a subject of my research as well as a tool that I use for my research, in the sense that I'm really interested in how to develop systems that support creative knowledge work. And one particular aspect of it that I think is super important is how do you synthesize information. And for example, when you're doing a literature review for a research project, you've got all these like, oh, someone's done this, someone's done that, here's a theory, here's the observation. And what you need to do to make a new contribution to some domain is you need to first frame the problem, and you need to synthesize what we know and don't know. And that's a very kind of artful process right now that has a lot of inefficiencies in it. And so what I'm trying to do is figure out, how do we build our tools to optimize for that? How do we develop social practices that lower the barrier to getting up to speed in the field of research, particularly if you're needing to do this across multiple fronts, if your research is interdisciplinary, like if you're a complexity scientist, or if you're trying to do some advising on health policy for the pandemic, you need to know not just about virology, but also epidemiology, have some sense of economics, have some sense of behavioral science about how people respond to different messaging, risky behaviors, like a ton of things that you have to sort of synthesize and integrate into a coherent whole. And then from that standpoint, then you can say, I recommend, this seems like a good idea, or here are 3 options that we can try out, and our belief that they will succeed is, you know, not 1 and not 0, usually somewhere in between. And so that's one core research project of mine right now, is like, how do we develop systems, broadly speaking, right, including tools and practices, to make that less of a hidden dark art that some people are somehow really good at, and then some people just really struggle with. Like, how do we develop more systematized? It will never be like an algorithm, but we would like to have some best practices, some good tools that are optimized for it. And that's where I think Rome is really exciting, because it's showing a design path into a kind of tool that seems very well suited for synthesis, where you have the ability to break information into blocks and pages that are remixable, linkable, and allow you to sort of get away from a hierarchical folder silo mindset, and have ideas living and breathing and interconnecting. And that's great as a vision, but people frequently get lost as they kind of venture into this abyss of chaos. And so what I'm trying to do is, I found something that works really well for me, and hopefully, as I articulated, other people can try it out and see if we're developing a set of practices and process innovations that could really help people instantiate it in the tool innovation of Rome, and then see if there are further tool innovations to further augment that process.
Yeah, I think that that's something really interesting about it, because Rome is a tool that lets you work in all these various ways, you know, like it doesn't tell you too much what you have to do, you know, but because of that, people are able to innovate on their own thinking practices in a very effective way, you know, like that you couldn't do in a product that perhaps restricted you a little bit more. And you're doing this in the context too of research about the pandemic, you know, like, so like you're doing research on both synthesis and actual practice of it too, like in conjunction with each other. You know, I think that's a really effective formula for insight.
Yeah, I agree. Like it's a really good canvas for that. But on the flip side, like I think you and I would agree that the freedom also allows people to use Rome in a way that is unhelpful, right? Because it's easy to, you know, it's easy to like try to go back to like ways of kind of making sure everything's in the folder and having this like kind of strict hierarchy. And Rome doesn't like tell you not to do it, right? You can try to structure things in the old way. So yeah, it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's I mean, that's basically the thesis of my career, right? User behavior and products matter to
Yeah.
determining a user's success, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so like that's why I'm really excited to hear more
Yeah.
about your knowledge synthesis model
Yeah.
and also see how it works.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm really glad we can talk through this. So my goal for this chat is basically to produce a companion to this document, which I will publish basically today. So this is like a conceptual model and practical guide for how to do knowledge synthesis, currently in Rome, but it's possible, I think, to implement this in any tool that has similar affordances as Rome, such as bidirectional linking and transclusion and so on. And so a lot of what composes this practice is very tacit, and it's really helpful to see examples in a more dynamic way. I've tried very hard to put in concrete examples in here, but so what I'm going to do is basically kind of talk through this model and try to spend more time actually showing, where is it? Here. Basically showing, oh, right up here is the where I first understood the significance of Rome. November 30th, 2019. I read the Rome research white paper, and yeah, so I'm going to talk through this model and then show some concrete examples of this in my Rome DB. So like I said, I gave the motivation already, right? Like the goal of this system is to make it possible to do synthesis in an effective way, and the initial audience would be researchers who struggle with knowledge synthesis. Like they say, there's this weird black box between I have found a bunch of papers to read. Typically, they're way more than you have time for, and the mythical endpoint of, okay, I feel like I've synthesized the literature and I now have a set of promising angles of attack on my research problem. I used to struggle a lot with this in terms of having a systematic process. You just kind of like blunder your way through, and then eventually with enough time and effort, you end up somewhere here. But what I want to do is basically articulate a way of doing this that you can learn and develop and practice as a skill and implement as a system. So this document, the goal is to give you enough to try to replicate this system if you want to try it out for your own work, and also articulate the rationale and theoretical grounding of the system enough so you can adapt it to your context. Because I'm working on particular kinds of research projects, and I've got particular technical, social constraints. It's important to me that you are not just, when you read this document, you feel you need to copy every single thing, but that you're empowered to see, okay, I kind of see why this design decision is made, and figure out if it works for you or not in that particular implementation. And if you feel like you need to change something, you can.
Yeah.
So that's the goal. And I think this will be most helpful for people who have experienced some pain with lit reviewing and are familiar with some kind of network notebook, like Rome, maybe Obsidian, Remnote, TiddlyWiki, Tinderbox, any number of tools that are emerging now, which I think now includes Notion, because Notion now has bidirectional links. So to really start to make sure we're grounded, this is about synthesis, right? And I want to make sure we understand what we mean by synthesis, right? So kind of a contrasting pair of examples I think is helpful to start with. So imagine if you have like a set of observations here, right? Like if you read a lit review that basically said, Species vary. Some variations are bad and some help survival. Species struggle to survive. Some, but not all organisms pass on new offspring. Versus something like species struggle to survive. Species also vary, and some variations are good, some are bad for survival. Therefore, one precondition for species to survive and pass on offspring is by having or inheriting beneficial variations. This variation and selection process explains how we get the diversity of species we see today.
So
Hopefully,
it's just bringing together multiple.
It's bringing together something new
Yeah.
here that isn't in the collection of observations before, right? Namely, the explanation for the origin of species.
Yeah.
Right, there's a construction that happened here where we sort of changed the way that the observations related to each other and put something more than just an assemblage. We synthesized, or not we, Darwin, right? Hopefully you recognize this as Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection as a kind of really useful anchoring example. And you often know when you see like a lit review that's bad. It looks more like the former, where often you have like X person said this, X person said that, Y person said that, this other person said that, and there's nothing coming together into constructing a problem frame or a new point of view or a theory or something that's not the sum of the parts, right? So in this case, the synthesis yielded a theory. But often it will take the form of like a critical lit review that says, okay, therefore we should do this, or some kind of model. The document includes links to other documents that really flesh out what synthesis means. But usually I would expect researchers to kind of grok what I'm saying at an intuitive level.
How does this sort of synthesis vary from the sort of synthesis that you might need to come up with a solution to a product problem?
Yeah,
you know, or to
similar.
Navigate office politics in a really effective way.
So a good example, I think, is there's a document going around now that was synthesizing the literature on masks, right? So if you're like a government policymaker, right, and you're like, should we require a mask? Should we have a mask mandate, right? There's a body of literature and observations behind that will hopefully inform that decision, right? You want to say, like, on the balance, some conditions for recommending a mask mandate might be we have sufficient evidence that there probably is some effect, and that the implementation is feasible and doesn't have terrible costs, right? So hopefully you want those conditions to be met, and you need to get to an understanding of those conditions. That would be one example of needing a synthesis in a decision-making context. In my own work, we actually do build things, right? So as you're designing products, you do also want to have good theories of change, like a sense of the mechanisms, right? Like, this is the real pain point the user is facing, and this is the path that's leading to that pain point, and here are mechanisms of action that we can operate on, and then you design things that operate on that, on those pain points. And actually, I mean, in design user research, right, synthesis is commonplace, right? It's usually a very important step in user research, is really trying to understand what the problem is, right? In this case, the synthesis is a problem frame. Like, we believe that this is actually I can show a good example of, in HCI research, this will take the form of like a design argument.
Would you zoom in a bit, please?
Yeah. I'm gonna pull it up, and then
great.
Yeah, let's see. LaTeX failed to load. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, but you can start to see here, like, your design kind of rests on various assumptions, right? What is the actual need? What's the evidence?
Would you just zoom in a little bit, please? Like, browser zoom. Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And if it makes sense to zoom out to like visualize something, feel free. But
no.
Generally, this is around what people can see well.
Yeah. Let me pull. I think there's a visual form of this that's helpful just to look at. Um,
Hmm.
yeah. So yeah, look at this, right? So good designs rest on a good design argument, right? That
Hmm.
these are my stakeholders. This is what they want to achieve, but these are the obstacles that get in the way. Each of these need to rest on some informed understanding, right? Like if it turns out that they
Hmm.
don't want to achieve goal G, then you're host. Or if you're these aren't the real obstacles, then you build a thing and it doesn't help, right? So
Okay, so synthesis here, in this case, it's being represented, it's understanding, essentially. Like is
correct.
synthesis, synthesis is sort of like the output of understanding.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful way to think about
Hmm.
um, that's the product. Yeah, it's understanding, it's insight.
Hmm.
And the word synthesis is meant to evoke the sense that it's transcending the sum of its parts, right? You could have each of these things on its own, but here it's being synthesized into a design argument that is the basis of an effective product or effective
Yeah.
design. Yeah, yeah. So this will be another core example of what the system is meant to enable you to produce
Hmm.
in a sustainable way, right? Because people often find their way to these things, but often with a lot of trial and error, a lot of effort,
Hmm.
and sometimes you never get to this because you just don't have time, or you never quite figure out how to pull things together.
So how do you get to there? Do you have like an example of one of these sorts of synthesis? And could you maybe show us the way that you got there?
Yeah, I've got things in progress. So one example right
Hmm.
now is let's see, the distance. I think would be a good one. What's the effect of analogical distance? Right. So I've got a bunch of effects, a bunch of papers trying to get at the idea of if I'm going to show you something to inspire you to come up with creative ideas, do I show you something that's very close to your domain, or do I show you something that's far away? Like, if you're
Mm.
working on like organizing people, is it helpful to tell you about how ants swarm together or how flocks of birds coordinate? Or is it more helpful to show you closer things about how other groups of people organize to enable you to come up with creative ideas?
Mm.
And turns out the literature is quite mixed on this, and this was the topic of my PhD thesis. Um, I'm here trying to replicate the synthesis I did for my thesis, which basically said um, the evidence is mixed. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's not, but there's a core problem of we're not having a long enough observation period to really tell whether the effects are positive or negative. And that was the basis of the design for my research, for my study, where I tried to make sure that there was a long observation period. So that's a concrete
Mm.
example of like a review of the literature that looked at the details and pulled them together and said, okay, A, the picture is inconclusive, but B, from a theoretical standpoint, the effects of showing you things that are far away probably need time to show up. And so we want to make sure
Hmm.
that the previous studies do not allow for enough time for that to happen.
Okay, so I'm
Therefore,
noted. Or sorry, say what you finish what you were
and then
saying.
therefore we designed the study to get at that critical thing that will help us to tease apart what's going on.
Hmm.
Yeah,
So could you maybe just like show us real quick and just describe to us the structure of this page?
yeah. So this page has a title, right? Obviously, and the important thing is that um, we have a bunch of block references coming in from sources, right? So each red thing here, each pink thing here is a paper. right? It's someone ran a study or described something, and that's informing my synthesis, right? So for
Mm-hmm.
instance, this is one paper where they did basically a case study of a bunch of innovation cases, and this was the result, one of the observations that are important to keep in mind, right? They basically didn't find a relationship,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's informing. I put that under inconclusive, right? And then there's some mixed findings and some negative findings, some positive examples and findings as well. So this is in
Mm-hmm.
progress. This is in
Yes.
progress.
So basically what I'm seeing here is that you have a lot of block references that you're using as evidence um,
Correct.
for various claims. And you're also in those block references, they're going to be pointing towards like the specific part in the paper, you
A
know,
specific result. Yeah.
yeah, the specific context, I guess, of
Yeah.
that claim you're making.
Correct. Yeah. So
Same
I
with the
mean,
page
this.
references, really. Like it seems like they're both doing that, but
Well, yeah. So I
page
think it's a
references are
crucial.
just
Just
broader.
it's a crucial. Yeah. Exactly. Right. So ankle actually has a bunch of other results that
Mm-hmm.
don't inform this question necessarily. Right. So it's important to me to use the block reference to those particular results that do inform this question, rather than just simply linking to ankle, the paper, which does a whole bunch of things, and that really doesn't help me when I'm trying to reason through. Who cares if like 5 people said this, 6 people said this? I care about what they actually found, what the differences in methods might be, differences in context, and so on. So I need that information that's written up as this block that I then block graph in.
Mm-hmm. And you also have a page reference in there too, in the same block. Why do you have both?
Because ideally I don't need it, because it makes it easier for me to see, to get to other aspects of, so ankle. It's important for me to know that this was a management paper, this was in 2010, and there's a bunch of other details about the methods that are content for this page.
Mm-hmm.
And also, this is something I need for writing. Like if I were to write this up um, for a journal paper or something, I would want to have this citation because I have to. That's the requirement for academic writing. So this is partially like a concession to make it slightly easier to access this information, but also to make it easier to export,
Mm-hmm.
to when I want to write outside of Rome, to like write up a paper of some kind.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So what's the synthesis model that got you here?
Yeah. So you're starting to see some of it already, but let me talk
Mm-hmm.
through it. So there's sort of, and we'll start with this data model. I think this is the clearest place to start with. Basically, you have 4 things. Okay. We have observation notes, which are something like what you just saw, where they are a key result from a paper or a key observation, but phrased in a very past tense contextualized way so that I
Mm-hmm.
don't overgeneralize from it. So it's contextualized as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Then there are synthesis
Can
notes.
you give just an example of an observation real quick?
Yeah. So for example, let's say we're trying to understand COVID transmission risk with children. This particular paper may have this result that they did a contact tracing study of these families, and they found that the COVID secondary attack rate for children under 10 was 2 times lower than adults. Right. So this is
Mm-hmm.
a observation that they reported. This is like a result.
An
Um,
observation of like a specific instance of a
correct.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So these should be written as much as possible to avoid generalizing to like broad statements. That's the role of synthesis notes, which are going to be something like children are approximately half as likely to contract COVID given equivalent exposure, right? That might be a claim that applies to children. And notice the declarative kind of tense here, like are, as opposed to maybe or are or were. Like this is like intended to be a generalized claim. And this hopefully is coming from a bunch of these, right? Where the preponderance of evidence is pointing in this direction. But there's probably a counter synthesis note that has the opposite claim that children are as likely to contract COVID as adults. And there will be a different set of sources that will be supporting that as well. And then the job of synthesis is to try to figure out, do we maybe accept one versus the other, or do we generate a different explanation, or do we now need to conduct more studies to really tease out what are the things that are going on here?
Okay, so basically what we've got here is you have an observation or multiple observations of specific instances of things. And then that leads you to a synthesized claim that can apply to more instances than original. Okay, great.
Yeah. So if you're familiar with research papers, right, these would be the things you would see in the results sections, right, where they try to be as specific as possible. And then this would be like the headline in the abstract or in the conclusion where they say this is what it means, right? And you probably see something like this in a news article about a paper, but actually all that a paper can show is this, right? All that it can contribute is particular observation notes, and then they can say, we think that this implies blah, and they might be stronger in saying, our results agree, this observation note is the same as these 5 other papers, and therefore we have stronger evidence that this is the case, right?
So what I'm liking so far is that, and I'm excited to see how this ends up working in your system precisely. But like what I'm excited to see so far is essentially that this is a process for going from like observations to synthesis, which seems really great to get systematic.
Yeah, in previous incarnations of my system, and you'll see some of it still, there's still traces of it. I wasn't as disciplined in making these distinctions. And so that's very dangerous for me because I often would sort of rush to a conclusion and have no way to backtrack in a principled way to really think through more nuances. Like in past, I might say something like, this, children are approximately half as likely, blah, 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 and then cite this without sort of having this in between. And so this allows for not just discipline and rigor, but also creativity, because you can question, receive wisdom in a much more nuanced way, because you can go back to the details. Like suppose we have like 6 observations that this particular system didn't work, right? Rather than saying that's the closed book, this system is bad, you can go back to those observation notes and say, oh, well, maybe, what's happening in this context? Are these the right users? Is it the right way to evaluate? Maybe this was like in the 80s when conditions were not favorable, right? So that allows you to sort of reinterpret and question past knowledge to come to a different conclusion in a principled way.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I'm picturing in my own context, which is that I'll be thinking about product decisions, like with guided track, for example. We have gone through multiple different iterations of the system we're going to end up going with for onboarding. But like along the way, we've had to pivot in response to new evidence, like some
Mm-hmm.
user interview signaled to us that this idea was wrong, you know, or that maybe I was misconceiving it. So I'm picturing having a solid, like, named process in pipeline like this would allow me to revisit those decisions and ask myself, okay, are the claims that got me here, does any of their evidence look different to me now? You know, and
Have
then I can
conditions change?
rebuild a new principle and a new idea from there to figure out how to pivot.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a really good application of this, right? And I just want to point out also, right here I write paper, but I'm going to change that so that it's clear that this could be like a direct observation or a conversation with somebody, right? The principle is this is kind of like data, right? As close to data as possible, and then this is theory or interpretation. The distinction is not as clean as in terms of formal terms, but pragmatically, I find it very useful to try to discipline myself to separate them as much as possible to avoid conflating them, right? So this could be like I ran an interview, or like maybe like my meeting notes with you right now could be a source, and something that you pointed out and you said, I had this conversation with someone else and I saw this. That could be an observation note that informs my emerging understanding of something, right? So this is applicable even when you're processing like not academic papers. I actually have like pilot data from my own research that I write these observation notes from. They're not published yet, but they still inform my understanding, right? In this pilot study, we saw this, or someone else wrote a blog post and this turns out to be an existence proof of something, right? It's not an academic paper, but it still can enter the conversation along with other sources to inform my synthesis.
Yeah. So what's the questions part?
This is the exciting thing. I think credit to you. Like I think this is an evolution also of you can kind of map these two terms to like the traditional Zettelkasten of like this is like permanent notes and this is like literature notes. In practice, I found that trying to rush to this is a bad idea. And often the most powerful way to structure engagement with sources and thinking through things is to have good questions that really are organizing my thinking. And it turns out that's actually basically how research projects go anyway, right? They're driven by one or more powerful research questions that inform some larger question that we care about. And you decide to study this question if you find that their synthesis of available literature doesn't give you a satisfactory answer, right? If it's like we only have 2 studies that say one thing and 2 studies that say another thing, and there's no way to like arbitrate between them, we have contradictory synthesis claims for this question. Therefore, we need to look at it more, right? And so that's a typical rationale for a good research project. It's like trying to say, here's the if it turns out that for a particular question the literature is unanimous and the evidence base is amazing, then that's not research anymore, right? You don't need to do anything with it, right? And so like this is kind of the much more powerful thing for when you're trying to generate new knowledge, right? It's driven by questions. What do we not know? And so like making that like a first class object has been quite important for me. So that's important for the process of how it plays out, where you'll start with questions and sources, generate a bunch of observation notes as you read, and then try to come to syntheses, and then assess whether the question is solved or not. And if it's not, then you pursue it further. If it is solved, then you use it as a building block to get to a different question. But having these separate turns out to be quite important.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Could you maybe show us an example of one of your question pages, because like when I'm picturing this in my head, I feel as though the questions are probably the core navigational layer of this, at least when
Yeah,
you're
yeah, I think they're the
revisiting
highest. I
things.
think they're the highest
Yeah.
level. So the system is still in progress, but
Mm-hmm.
the most recent, yeah. So can deep learning discover analogical representations? What tension points exist in the quest for inclusion in participatory design? How does analogy actually happen in the process called? These are all examples of like burning questions that we're working with right now. And this is again that question that we just looked at, like what's the effect of distance on creative output? How many do I
Mm-hmm.
have? Got 29 right now.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, it's less, right? Because this is oh no, this is a starting point of a question that I haven't turned into a page yet. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, that's kind of the great thing about like Rome with its organization just through
Yeah.
inline addition, I guess, you know,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that you can
Yeah.
just be writing about something totally different and be
Yeah.
like, you know what, I think this one's a question, so I'm
Yeah.
gonna
Yeah. Yeah.
just tag the
Exactly.
block. You
Yeah.
know, you don't need
Exactly.
to make a whole page.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think you're right that this is really useful, in some ways, more useful entry point into the synthesis casting, I guess. Um, in the sense that at the top level right now, I've got a bunch of projects that I'm working on, right? And then
Yeah.
each of these projects have a set of important questions that are driving them, right? I'm doing them because they're questions I want to answer. And then underneath those questions are the syntheses that are informing those questions, right? So in the sense, there is a kind of a hierarchy, hierarchical way to enter the network that is a bit more manageable, right? I get it
Mm-hmm.
into it from a question that I keep thinking about and come back to it. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so these
Great.
are,
So what's one that you have filled out?
let's see. Um, yeah, so why don't we jump to this one?
Oh, and I just want to say that like you know, I think that having this component in your system for questions is so crucially important.
Yeah,
You know, like I found it to be one of the most useful things that I do in Rome, because it's like I'm just trying to track my thoughts, track and develop my thoughts through time, you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
and having these questions, it's it helps you know what to search for.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, I find these much richer than like a one page, one term concept page, you know, like because
Hmm.
these are quite noisy. But this is they're going to have not as many link references for you to wade through,
Yeah.
but they're also, yeah, they're pretty good entry points. So here's one that I've started filling out that has spawned some synthesis notes, right? So this is really about like if we just use the latest language models, does that enable us to cross domains and find things that are similar even though they are from different domains, right? This idea of analogy. And um, there was enough in here that I turned it into a synthesis note, right? That's pulling
Hmm.
from each of these, like all these are block references from particular papers, right? So this one shows that um, this particular deep learning model of language is really bad at modeling similarity of verbs compared to
Hmm.
nouns and adjectives. But it's based on this test. So that's one line of evidence that these models of language struggle with relational similarity. And then here's another example. You may have heard in the news, like, oh, we've got these models that can do analogy. It turns out when you dig deep into the types of analogy problems, they do really well with things that are like case relations. Actually, I can pull it up just to demonstrate because I forget the details right now. But yeah, check it out. So it does really well on these kinds of things. So case relations like soldier, gun, plow, earth, but it does really poorly on things that are for similarity, like simmer is the same as boil. Car is to auto as simmer is to boil, things like that. Which I don't know if it's meaningful to you, but it's very meaningful to me. Like these are fundamentally different kinds of similarity. And it's very consequential to me that the models would do much better on some kinds of problems versus others, and that helps me think through maybe it's not modeling enough of language to be able to get to this kind of similarity that I care about. Right. So I read these papers, wrote these observation notes, and grounded them in the appropriate context snippets so that I could come back and reason through them and then write this out.
Okay, so the top level bullet that you have right now in your main view.
Oh yeah.
So that's an observation note.
That's an observation note, exactly.
And then below it are
context snippets.
Context. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, they're basically annotations, right? Like this would be again like similar to a literature note in a Zettelkasten system. But what I find lacking in the Zettelkasten system is that I don't trust my memory that much. You know, I don't trust that I've managed to distill everything that I need to write out this thing. As you saw, my memory did fail, right? And it turned out to be useful to be able to go back to these context snippets and say, okay, yeah, I remember now. These are some examples of this kind of problem versus that kind of problem. The details matter, right?
Yeah.
The details really matter for synthesis. So yeah, so this is like a structure of it where, yeah, it's informing this larger question, right? And there's an argument that's starting to emerge, right? That here's one claim about analogies, that they're fundamentally about relational similarity, and these class of models struggle with relational similarity. Therefore, I'm skeptical. My provisional answer is probably not to this question, right? But it's not a definite no, because there's some questions about, you know, is it a limitation of the model itself, or is it just doesn't have enough data or the right kind of data? Because it turns out if you fiddle with the model a little bit, you know, you can close the gap a little bit. That's what they showed in this paper. So my current belief is probably not, but with a question mark, right? So this, I think a good example as well of like, people might be skeptical of some technical solution, but the details of the evidence really matter, right? This was with particular kinds of models trained on particular kinds of data in 2016, and things may be different now, right? And so being able to reason through how things are different is important.
Okay, so interesting.
Yeah. What are you seeing here?
Well, so I'm seeing a bunch of things, you know, especially since, like, one question I have, it seems like you're using a lot of sibling nodes there. So like, I'm looking at the block where it says, so basically the reasoning for being cautious about deep learning goes as follows. And then below that there, you have a bunch of separate blocks that are, you know, like they're sibling nodes. So that means they're not going to show up as related to each other, you know, in a query that you have.
Yeah, I don't like that.
You don't like that. So that's something you're changing. Or
I'm not changing it because I have hope that I could wrangle like a smart block or something to make it so that we can find them. It makes sense semantically for them to be siblings because they're steps in an argument, right? Yeah. And I will write that way in an argument. But from a querying perspective, it's not optimal. I agree. There's no link between them right now that's easy to recover from a query, but I don't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily query for these kinds of things anyway. I would query for, give me all the questions about this project. And that's why I
Mm-hmm.
make sure that there's this indentation.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, or give me all the papers that are related to this project. Um,
Oh, okay. So just to make sure that I understand, but also
yeah, yeah,
that other people understand too. So it's like you use queries more to help you get started with the navigation than to necessarily be the end point of a navigation. So like you're just searching for the open questions related to a project type stuff.
yeah,
But then there's also uh, to describe what we were talking about earlier with the indentation of
yeah.
those notes. Uh,
It's obviously
base,
a me. Yeah, yeah,
Basically what I'm saying here for viewers is that um, if let's say the
I wouldn't
block,
be able to
can you
link
just like
the.
show an example of like what I mean, like when I'm saying like indentation to model the argument, I
Yeah.
guess, and like
So, like for example, if we wanted to um, find links between this particular page, right? Oh, I got a one. Yeah. So we're co-mentioning relational categories and analogy, right? Um,
mhm.
this query would not turn up any of these, I think, right?
Yeah, even though they're like all in the argument,
Correct.
so
Yeah,
they
zero
they
results.
should be related to each
Yeah,
other.
they
So
should
I
be
think
related.
I think what
Yeah,
you were saying earlier was not so much like you
yeah,
recognize that according to current Rome rules, not having that indentation is suboptimal,
yeah.
but Rome's rules are wrong here, and they should
Yeah,
basically just figure out
yeah,
that sibling nodes can be
yeah,
represented
yeah,
as related in sequence, and
yeah.
that's just another sort of rule.
If I
Yeah,
did this, then it would show up. See?
yeah,
Um, and that's great for querying, but terrible for me when I'm writing, right? Like,
yeah.
because if an argument has 15 steps, I don't want it to be 15 deep, right? Um, so yeah, that's a good point. Um, I if they are mentioned in the same block though, right? Um, I can recover them, right? So just to make sure that we can see that, right? So if I wanted to know um, if I've got anything about analogy and word embeddings, this would come up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I'm not going to do it now because it's kind of lagging, but
Yeah, that's fine.
yeah,
So one of the things that I'm noticing too is that you have a few of your claims on this page too. So like it seems like you have
right. Yeah, all
arguments
the
at
green stuff
various
here.
stages
Yeah, the green
here.
stuff here are things that I believe enough or understand enough to be able to
Mm-hmm.
articulate as a synthesis note, right? Um, this one I want to write a synthesis note about, but I'm not ready to yet. So I tag it as a seedling.
Mm-hmm.
But there's like some really fascinating stuff in here that I know I want to write about. So these ones I've processed enough that I can start to refer to that. Um, there's no real reason for me not to do this right now.
Yeah,
I want to
let's
do.
build one.
Yeah, I mean, so this one will be. I will want to change this though, right? So, um, and I'll make it a Z so it shows up as green.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll probably still tag this as a seedling here. I should have a smart block for this template, but it doesn't save as much time to justify me doing that right now. And I know that one key source is and Kurtz. Is it Kurtz? I think it's Kurtz. It's this person, but I don't. Yeah, there we go. Getting rid of the boundaries. So that's the paper that will inform. There's a whole bunch of papers in this one that will inform this claim. Yeah. So I guess at this point, we can kind of jump a little bit to like, why would it be useful to have this be a page?
Yeah.
So for instance, this is the pattern of the writing inbox, right? So let's say I come across new paper, right? Let's say, Rob showed this paper to me, right? This is fake, but possibly relevant for right? Then that becomes like a part of my writing inbox, right? When I come back to, I want to think about this, I can go back and say, okay, let me go look at this paper and see what's in there that I can start to refer to this. So this becomes like a hook for me to be able to build over time. And that's why I find it helpful to have that as a page instead of just a block, because there's too much text in my graph right now that block reference search is not very helpful. It's just too much text.
Yeah, so it's like I could imagine, it seems like when you're writing in your daily notes, you're sort of just like using your various claims, your various like Zettels all throughout in various different contexts, know, and so it's helpful. So like eventually you just have a lot for any given page. So it's really helpful to be able to narrow down in that way.
Yeah. Let me go back for a second to the model. So we've talked a lot about these.
Yeah.
Right. And so this, I think, is, I guess, the last piece we haven't talked as much about. Right. We mentioned it, right? Context snippets. Those are key, right? To be able to see not just this bare claim here, but to be able to link it to, this is the actual results table, and this is the actual details of the model, right? That I have as a block, writing about what the model is and what the target was, what the data set was, right? And each of these have like screenshots from the paper that help me recontextualize. So these are all examples of context snippets that ground this observation note. Other examples might be if it was a quote from a user, like I would probably, from an interview, like I would try to capture a screenshot of the quote, a key figure of an image or something like that. Those would be important. And I tend to write the page number here so I can jump back to that location in the PDF if I need to.
Okay, so what we're basically seeing here is, if you go back to that synthesis page where the block was on.
Yeah, right here.
Yeah.
Which turns out I cannot jump to this from here to that page.
Oh, really?
Did you know that? I can't find a way to do it. Do you know how to do it?
Interesting.
Right?
No,
I would
if
expect you to
clicking
be
on
able to
it
jump
doesn't
to.
work.
Yeah, so I have to double, like, I don't know.
I mean, I guess like if you wanted to actually open the thing up instead of just expand, you could focus on block and then
but it's kind of
expand. But basically what we're seeing here is you have you're using block references of your various observations all throughout this page. And then whenever you are doing a block, but like those block references are always going to have the context for the block either indented underneath it or alternatively another block ref, and so you have this like smooth pathway from your arguments supporting a synthesis claim or a question back to the observations that formed those arguments, back
Right.
to the context that informed your
Exactly.
observations.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all about context. Yeah. And so one question you might ask is, well, why don't I write observation notes as pages? And the answer partially is that these tend to be long, so it would be annoying to have that as a page title, but I like them to be part of the paper because that's important to me, right? To have all this other information accessible as linked to in some way, at least accessible to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like one important example of context from the paper that would be important for me would be if it turns out this paper was replicated, right? That would be information about the paper, or like if it has 500 citations versus 5, that's also important to think about. And so that would be sort of nearby or proximal to that observation note that might inform my assessment of it. Or if, for example, I have like 6 different observation notes that support this claim, but they all were from the same author, that would give me less confidence than if there were 6 observation notes from 6 separate authors that are independent, right? So all that context is also important to ground my reasoning through from observation note to synthesis. There's no computational way for me to query that right now. So it's this like manual thing, which is fine, right? My goal is not to automate as much as possible, but to make it accessible so I can reason through it. It would be nice if we could build some tools to automate that, and that's part of my goal. But this is already a huge upgrade to my process to have this information on hand.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's funny. It's one of those things where a lot of Roam users want a lot of things, right? So like, for example, I would also love to be able to run a query on all of the block references on a page and see who the author that supported that block reference was. You know, to execute that now in Roam would be insane, and I wouldn't advise anyone to try to do that. But you know, it's just like the thing about it is we want these things because Roam was such like a stepwise improvement, I guess. And we didn't even have the words to describe it before, but like now we're like, I can fly through the air. Why can't I fly through the air at the speed of sound and be a disco ball while it's happening?
Exactly. So we might be able to do some of this stuff with Smartblocks, but I don't know, because the Smartblocks will allow us to traverse the tree to be able to collect things with JavaScript, kind of simulate traversing the graph. So that could be a stopgap for now, but that's something that I don't feel a strong need for yet. Once I get to a scale of like, let's say I got 60 papers and I want to explore how they vary by age or country or the measurement method, then I probably want to start to be able to have queries that can slice and dice in those ways, given that the information is available, which it is right now. But yeah, I have to do it manually right now, which is fine. It's already much better than having like random scratch notes in Google Docs.
Yeah, and I mean, you've said as much yourself before that like sometimes there's desirable levels of friction, you know, to finding things, right? Like Bohan, for example, he uses block references to organize a lot of sorts of things you do, and so he'll end up with like a list of things, a list of his permanent notes that are related to another permanent note, you know, and I asked him like, okay, wouldn't it be nice to filter down this list? But like
Yeah.
the thing that he responded was like, no, it's like a good exercise for me to look through all
Yeah.
these things, you know, and
Yeah.
to remind myself of their existence, you know, like the
Yeah.
just the act of navigation
Yeah.
helps make sure that you're familiar with what you have in your database, so that way you can do more effective queries later.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a nice, like, it might vary by like
Hmm.
user and context, but having a sense of like desirable difficulty is a helpful way to think about the system. Because in some ways, what I'm trying to do is adding friction, right? Separating out these observation notes from the synthesis notes, from the context snippets.
Hmm.
But it's for a reason so that I don't rush to unsupported syntheses or miss useful insights from differences in context. So I'm adding that friction so that I see those things and I have to work through them. And
Okay, so
yeah,
if you've got all that, if you really want to like come up with um, evidence-based synthesis and you
yeah,
don't want to rush to it, so you're trying to slow yourself down a little bit, putting yourself in this process that
yeah,
makes sure that every observation has context associated with it. Make sure,
hmm,
like
yeah.
where's room for something like speculation that in
Yeah.
that sort of system.
My speculations happen in fleeting notes, in daily
Mm,
notes, right? And they would be hooked to questions, right? So if I speculate about a question, I can reference it in daily notes, or I can write it in the. I mean, right now these kind of feel a little bit like speculation. Um, Going back to that. Um, yeah, never mind, right? But like I could speculate here and say, I think this might be true, um, and relate that to some question that I care about. So they wouldn't necessarily be represented as synthesis notes unless I ground them. And questions would be a great place for speculations, right?
yeah,
Right.
true.
And that's ultimately where you want to end up in with like some creative, potentially impactful speculations, right? Could this be true? Would be a useful question. Could having desirable difficulty intentionally designed into a synthesis system um, significantly improve the efficacy? So that might be a question. Or is it possible to achieve a powerful Zettelkasten without any page references, right? And so that might be a
Hmm.
question as well. Um, Not necessarily a research question, but like a question nonetheless for a project. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, that's a good
So,
question. Like where would speculation go?
hmm.
That's kind of the process of yeah, that's a process level question of where it would
Yeah.
go.
Because I mean,
Yeah.
just like the thing that's in my head with that is, um, for me in my database when I keep track of my open questions,
Yeah.
um, one of the key things to recognize about it is that I'm essentially leaving clues for my future self.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Yeah.
trying to say like, hey, here, based on this question, you can filter linked references in this way, or you can
Yeah.
do X query to try to find an answer related to this. Um, and so like the speculation though there too, that's also partially of saying, here's an idea that I want to explore,
Mm-hmm.
but so that way when you're sitting in front of your computer in front of a blank daily notes page, you
Yeah.
don't just need to ask yourself, okay, what do I think today?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like you kind of have a starting point to jump off from.
Yeah, yeah. I think I've got some examples. Let's see, maybe like
Hmm.
there's a very speculative research project right now. See if I exemplify this pattern. What is material knowledge? Um, this page doesn't really have a ton of content in it right now because it's that's the guiding research question. Oh man, I didn't even write. Yeah. So some of the speculation happens in meeting notes where we're discussing this question, and then we'll write out some. Let's see. Yeah. So this is a speculation. I guess speculations live in linked references then, in some way for me, right? So we're speculating that these are various dimensions of this concept, but I haven't upgraded them to like a formal, like synthesis note. They're not substantiated necessarily. These are like ideas that we've thrown around. But I will tie it back to speculating about this question. Yeah. Few things I came across recently.
I'm definitely gonna steal that. The way that I've been doing it is whenever I have an open question, I tag the block that I have the open question in. I tag that with open question. And so
interesting. Yeah.
And so then I'll be able to like I'll still be able to run a query by project to find my open questions related to a project. I don't need to use any metadata in my approach to do that because I just use the indentation. But the thing about that too is then I just like block reference everything. And so I'm doing the same thing that you're doing where I'm tagging the question, but maybe it'd be helpful if we sort of like try to figure out which approach, what the advantages and disadvantages of each approach is, just like very quick. Actually, no. Yeah.
I mean, I think that you already mentioned one of the trade-offs, right? Which is, right now, the way Rome works, page references are a lot more amenable to filtering and exploration in that sense. Like, can we filter block references?
You can't filter by block reference,
right?
But you can query by block reference.
Got it. Yeah. So I guess you have to use queries. I find it helpful to say like maybe like I wanted to know what this paper keeps coming up, so maybe I want to say what can I say from this one for this question, or like what did we do? I remember that we talked about this in a meeting, and so then I can query the meeting notes maybe. Like queries, I guess, are directed. Like you can't explore it as much, right? You have to like write them, so they're like less for exploratory search and more for like targeted search. And this filtering facilitates exploratory search, where you surface like, oh, this person keeps coming up or something. That might be some of the trade-offs.
I don't know if I would say that queries are just for like exploratory. I mean, with queries, like you can write multiple queries. I think is kind of.
I don't think it's a hard distinction. I agree.
I think that though the distinction you're pointing towards is when you're in the filters, you can just look through a list of tags and you can filter based on that. And so that provides maybe a quicker overview than looking through the actual blocks where things are tagged and you see the results of the query.
I think that's right. So I wouldn't make a hard distinction between like one is for X versus Y. Like it's all about affordances, right? Like what is slightly easier in one formulation versus the other, right? With this one, you have the additional affordance of being able to see these tags surface with the frequencies, so that might facilitate discovery of queries that you might not have thought of, which is helpful for exploratory search, which you can in principle do with block queries, but the affordances aren't as helpful, right? You have to sort of look through.
Interesting. I mean, I'm even thinking, Yeah, I think that your approach here is probably better than mine. Mostly, like I think that block references, like the advantage is essentially that you don't need to tag the metadata in the original thing.
Mm,
You know, like I can
mm,
just tag a specific, like if I'm
yeah,
writing
yeah,
about guided track in the community and
yeah,
an open question is just tagged somewhere beneath there, then I'm going to
yeah,
be able to query by that and find that
yeah,
open question, you know.
yeah, yeah,
But but then
yeah.
but I think that having it as a page, like,
It makes it easier for autocomplete for me, right? So like
yeah, exactly.
I used to like I've got a list of project ideas and the ones that I keep referring to, I turn into a page, right? So I've got a list of project ideas. Many of them are just blocks, right? Here's an idea that could be a project. And then the ones that are significant enough, I turn into an idea, a page. Like this
Hmm.
one has, I think now probably 20, 30 references. But some of these are like, wow, wouldn't it be fun to study the SRS questions that might most reliably support knowledge requirements, right? So this is like a project idea, and I've only referred to it once, right? But, you know,
Yeah.
this one I'm developing, right? I guess that's the distinction. If I'm continuing to develop this over time, I would rather it be a page reference so I can build a writing inbox for it and be able
Hmm.
to use it as a hook to collect material. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
that totally makes sense. And the thing that's nice about it too, also, is as you were describing before, the linked references to the question, that's essentially your speculation about it, right?
correct.
But
Yeah, yeah.
then on the page itself, you can put your crystallized thought related to that question,
Which I
you know,
know is
and
more crystallized if it's a Z, right? If it's a green, page,
right.
then I'll know there's probably some meat behind it. Um,
Hmm.
yeah. Yeah, this is a good question. Like, so I mean, that's a good segue, I guess, into like the second part of this document talks about like the process, like how do you actually start with the set of papers and so on and end up with what, right? And so the emerging process, you do start with articulating some questions, and then you collect a bunch of stuff and you read the papers and write observation notes, and then you sort of fill out the middle, right? You have these high level questions, and then you start to say, okay, here's a bunch of observation notes, and here are some syntheses, and then you start to develop them and compose them, and then eventually you start to identify some fun speculations, right? Some questions that are very compelling that don't have enough synthesis behind them, and that's your direction, right? That's where you want to go. Um, and so the speculation, I guess, happens um, in here, right? Like you in the space between collecting a bunch of observations and trying to articulate answers to your
Hmm.
questions. Some of them will never go beyond speculation because it turns out there's no observations to support them, but nevertheless they seem plausible and interesting. And then you're like, let's pursue that. That's a fun research project. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think that's helpful to think through.
So
Um,
I really like your system. I'm just gonna throw that out there. I think that it's really, I think it's really powerful. Just this idea of being able to, like, you start with your questions. What are you trying to figure out?
yep,
Um, you bring in observations from your various sources,
correct.
and those are connected to each other.
Hmm.
You then um, from those observations you get synthesis that helps support your questions, like I think that that's all a very smooth process. And just being able to trace it back, like a lot of people, they talk, I've heard a lot of talk about from people about being able to track your claims back to your sources and back to your
Hmm.
reasoning.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen all that much description of why that was important.
Hmm.
And I think that your description of being able to question your past reasoning
Yeah.
is absolutely crucial, you know, because it's like if you're trying to get a database, just like a knowledge base, I guess,
Yeah,
that is going to scale for
yeah,
years,
yeah,
then you also need to take into account that your views on the world are going to change over the
exactly.
years.
Yeah,
If they
exactly.
don't, then why you're not doing synthesis, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. So
Um,
this is
and
tuned for knowledge production, right? Where you're at the edge of
mm,
knowledge. Like if you were to like, I don't know, create a knowledge base for the structure of Java, like the programming language. It's
mm,
very mature. It's not really going to change, and so you don't need necessarily to question it, right? You just want like a good organizational structure. This is about when we don't know what's the case, right? We're trying to generate what's the best thing to do. How should I design this product? What's the right explanation for what's going on, right? So having the ability for these notes to be alive, to be able to question, to interlink and inform
yeah,
your thinking is the intent behind this. Yeah, and I guess I was going to say also that you mentioned that this is uh, smooth. I guess I want to mention that this is intended to also facilitate long-term reuse, right?
yeah,
Again, like this idea of like if you're working on this project that probably is going to take a while and other people want to build on it in the future, you want to um, enable future people, including yourself, to recontextualize, to question it, to revisit it, to take it apart, and maybe see it in a different light, right? And so, like my view is long term, and also crossing boundaries of people. Like, how can I pass on this knowledge to my students to help them think through things without having to, peer into my brain, right? So, being able to start to um, the dream is that if enough people do this critical mass for a topic area, they can start to share with each other, right? Instead of like you asking me, what should I read about creativity? I give you a subset of my database that consists of collections, observation notes, and syntheses and questions. And then you can go from there as a much better starting point than um, here's a bunch of papers. Now you need to spend 100 hours,
mm, hmm,
extracting what you actually want out of them and then piecing them together. I give you almost like a much better starting point. Um, and that's part of the friction of doing interdisciplinary work is you have to navigate all these fronts and you have like 60 papers, 100 papers to read, and it's just too much, right? Versus like having a starting point.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like it's not even just about the synthesis side of things, though it is geared towards that. It's
Yeah.
also about communication and
Mm-hmm.
letting people, if they trust you on your claims, they can just go ahead and trust you and leave it at that,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
but if
Yeah.
not, they can find out how you got to your claims
Correct.
and
And
they
maybe they do
can,
trust you, but like you said, like things changed, right?
yeah,
Or yeah, so to be able to, instead of saying, Rob says that this approach is bad, you have the basically the almost like the proof of work or the notes behind why Rob thinks that. Rob thought
hmm,
that in 2016. Rob today probably maybe will think something different because Rob has access to actually the observations and the context behind it and is able to look at the current situation and say, maybe things have changed, right?
yeah.
Um,
I mean, I think that's something really important to note about your system. Um, it may not we've bounced around in a lot of places
yeah, yeah,
during
yeah,
this. So
yeah,
like I don't it all I'm trying to say is that this system, like if you actually like read through it and you see the examples, like it's very simple, you know, in its principles. Like in fact,
yeah,
I was kind of noticing that I was doing a lot of these sorts of things without, you know, having a system, right? Like so for
correct.
example, I keep track of my questions, so
Yeah,
I always know what questions I have related to
yeah,
X, you
yeah,
know,
yeah,
and so there's that, but then there's also like just some core little rules of thumb in there too. Like
Mhm.
if you have some observation, then just try to find the evidence that's relevant to it and put it underneath it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you're trying to make a claim, then just source it from your observations and make sure those are connected. Like
Correct.
the 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 system you described, like you're showing stuff with page and block references, and,
Yeah.
and and so it's somewhat Rome specific in that sense, but in the
But
principles sense, it's not. Like someone could execute
exactly.
this in Obsidian, someone could execute
Yeah.
this in whatever
Yeah.
that has like bidirectional links, I guess,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
just on this basic principle of connect yourself back to the context and to your questions.
Yeah.
you know
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So I'm really glad you got that right, because that's the intent. Is right now I'm implementing it. That it's important to separate the principles from the implementation. Right. I'm
hmm
implementing it in Rome right now. The principles, hopefully, even if you take parts of them and change the way you write notes in Google Docs, that could be an upgrade. And you can implement this much more easily in a network notebook. Yeah, but exactly. Um, yeah, the hope is that this is simple enough that you can try it out um, and implement in your system, because probably you do some of it already. It's just like Rob said, like it's not like um, it's the intent is not to completely change the way you do things. It's to say, how do we just add a little bit more structure to the way you're doing things? Probably already want to do it.
hmm
And in that way, we have this shared language. It's going to help you, and hopefully it helps you help other people too, right? So if you like say, hey, come check out my Rome DB, instead of like pointing them to the chaos of daily notes, you can say, start here,
yeah.
right? Start with this synthesis question or this synthesis note, and people can sort of like look around. That's the
hmm
dream.
hmm
Yeah.
and I just want to add in one little fancy thing for the viewers who stuck around this long, is that like this system, it's got a general structure to it that's pretty easy to follow, but like you can do some fancy things with it too. Like the
Yeah.
thing that I do, for example, that I would immediately port over into this
Mm.
system is when I have my open questions, I
Yeah.
use when I'm like really trying to answer them as opposed to just like trying to speculate on them.
Yeah.
um, I will run a query that is essentially a translation of that open question. I'm asking myself, what stuff is already in
Mm-hmm.
my database that might
Yeah.
be related to this question or help me out on it?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, and doing that just kind of gives you like a starting point,
Yeah.
or multiple little starting points, but
Yeah.
that's just like a little fancy thing. I would maybe start like on on like one of the question pages. I might
Yeah.
start with a query, but
Yeah.
that being said, doing it as a page reference might make that a little bit less necessary. I guess just the distinction here is that
Mm-hmm.
like if you do it as a page reference and you're always like referencing that
Yeah.
page whenever you're talking about the question, then you'll be able to look through the linked references and
Mm-hmm.
see what thoughts are related to that question.
Correct.
But the advantage of doing the query type approach and getting a little bit fancier is then you can ask questions like more broadly, what sorts of things might be related to this that I wrote before I even came up with this question.
Yeah. 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 I think it's there might be some trade-offs too of like if you're already using a block reference query heavy right
Yeah.
approach, like you do that right because it's lower friction to changing. If you're doing more like page reference, link reference stuff, then like the implementation can vary as long as the principles remain.
And
As long as you understand. Yeah.
what would you say are those principles?
In this case, it's this idea of like, for me, I call it inboxing, right? Like collecting material that would inform when you actually go to develop that particular answers to those questions. I do it by collecting through page references. You do it
Mm,
through block references, but the principle is the same. You are collecting material that you then gather when you go to actually think about and develop that particular question. It's just a difference of implementation in how we gather, how we make sure it's linked to the question, and how we actually pull it together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, like the principle here is that your questions are related to your claims, are related to your observations that inform those claims, are related to your context that inform those observations. Like the specific way there's a lot of room for personal style, I guess, in how you use Roam and how you do this.
Yeah, and you can apply this, exactly. You can apply this to, like, this is for my academic context was developed in that, but you can imagine maybe seeing if any of this might be useful for trying to be a bit more rigorous about, I don't know, deciding, I used this approach to inform my decision-making about risk. Like, should I travel given that I was diagnosed with something, X time ago? And so I pulled in, dumped a bunch of articles and a bunch of things to like inform my thinking. And then I had a question, should I go to, when is it safe for me to travel? And there's a bunch of syntheses and observation notes. And so it can be used for decision making as well, probably too overkill for everyday decision making.
Sure.
But, if you wanted to, you could.
Yeah, and what's nice about it too is you have built-in time to germinate, I guess. Let the questions simmer for a little while because your system's robust enough that when you're ready to answer that question, you have the materials to go for it. Like you don't need to come up with the answer in one sitting.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is marinating. This last reference was, why is analog media so effective? November 16th, started in June. It's still marinating, right? And still collecting stuff and sending it into talking to people, and eventually it's going to find its way into something useful. And having it in this principle of either tracking as an open thing that I can link to or a page reference of a particular kind allows me to develop this over time. That's part of the principle of the system as well, is to that one effective way that people do synthesis is they basically block off like 3 months and then like intensely, do this process, but that's not sustainable for all cases. And so we want to be able to have a system that allows us to develop over time. Because sometimes it just takes a lot of time for an idea to crystallize, and you can't force it in 6 weeks. And so you need a system that allows you to maintain context over time and reuse things.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for this tour, Joel. This was both impressive. It was simple, it was informative. It's definitely changed the way that I look at my notes in a few different ways, and also just asking it's making me ask myself how I can formalize certain parts of my process that I think are relevant to what I'm actually trying to do, because like I mentioned, I do a lot of this stuff implicitly, but I haven't but in a lot of ways I haven't formalized a bunch of it. So that means it's more difficult to track.
Yeah. So the last thing I'll say is, in this document also, there's a screen recording of an hour-long session of me generating that note that we talked about. So you can actually see it play out. It's 7 minutes long. I sped it up 8 times. So that's another compliment to this document is we just talked about it right now. There's a process of it actually playing out over an hour where I'm developing that note. So hopefully that helps as well. But this is helpful for me too. Like, I guess we can also say, like, for the record, like, I don't think this process is perfect, right? It's working really well for me, but I really want to try and break it, right? I don't think it's bulletproof. I think that I think
Wait.
that
Oh, sorry. Say what you're saying.
yeah, I want people to, I would be super curious to people to try it out and see how it stretches and what
Hmm.
modifications would be helpful to make the system especially work well for a wide range of researchers. Like what are some of the bugs in the way I'm thinking about it that maybe idiosyncratic to how I do things. I don't want this to
Yeah.
be like it only works for me. And the only way to see this is to have people try it out. So that's the
Yeah.
motivation behind like sharing this document.